Hello, welcome back. This is the second episode in my Cold War coursework series. And this time I'm just going to be looking at a little bit at the ideological basis for the Cold War and explaining how some historians see the Cold War as being rooted in ideology. And because of that, they're more likely to see the Cold War starting earlier rather than later. Again, like the introduction episode that I did before, this links to a PowerPoint that you'll have, and you might find it useful to have that open at the same time. So firstly and briefly, the ideological basis of the Cold War. Well, I mean, obviously and simply, that is that the Soviet Union were communist and America and the West were capitalist, and also that they were liberal democracies. So we'll start with the communist stuff. Communism is based around the ideas that originated with Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German philosopher, not Russian. It just happened that communism took off in Russia. In fact, Karl Marx is buried in London, but he's a German philosopher. And his most famous writings, the Communist Manifesto. He also wrote a book called Das Kapital. In the Communist Manifesto, he said, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." And it was very much based around this perception of history, this interpretation of history that looked at a scientific interpretation of history that looked at the whole history of humanity as being defined by economics. And he felt that history was part of a story that was leading and kind of evolving, I guess, towards what he called communism in the end. So in Marx's view of history, there are 5 stages that we go through. Way back in the beginning is what he called primitive communism. There were no classes, no government. I guess so few people that you just kind of did your own thing and you swapped and exchanged and traded as and when you needed to. Stage 2 of the history of humanity was feudalism. In this era, there was a monarchy, and the monarch was usually absolute in their authority and power. Most of the population were peasants, and the revolutionary group in this stage were the middle classes, that as time went on, they began to demand more say over how the country was run. And I guess if you think back to your Stuart era, you can kind of see that in there with the battles between Parliament and the King early on over taxation. The middle classes there, the gentry, were effectively saying, look, we're paying the money, we want some say in how things went out. You can also see it perhaps in the way that the American colonies overthrew British rule because they wanted no taxation without representation. It's this idea that we have a stake in what's happening. We're paying for this. We demand some rights and some authority and some power in return. That revolution led through into phase 3 of the history of humanity, and that Marx said was capitalism. And he would have said that most of the world at his time of writing in the 19th century were capitalist, certainly the European world. In this phase of history, you have a parliamentary democracy. But the bourgeoisie, the middle class, are the dominant group. And remember that at the time Marx is writing, not everyone has the vote. And that certainly in Britain, I'm not sure about Germany, the MPs are not paid. So it's much easier in that day for the middle classes and above that to be in power. I mean, today it seems crazy that, privately educated elite would be running the country. But it's much easier for them to have and keep influence over the country. However, the workers now comprise the majority of the population, and Marx said eventually these workers will spot that they need to have a greater stake in society, and they will overthrow that bourgeois system, and they will establish their own system. This is phase 4, where the workers will control the state. They'll have to resist the bourgeoisie. There'll have to be a dictatorship of the proletariat to start with, proletariat of the urban working class. But the upside of that is that they'll be able to make society more equal because they're the workers. They'll spread wealth out and they'll include everyone. That stage, Marx said, is socialism, and it's on the path towards communism. Communism is our end goal, stage 5, where there's no state, no government, no classes, everyone is equal, lambs skip in the field, flowers bloom spontaneously, and the wealth of the country or the area is shared equally by everyone. So it's a beautiful view. Now, that is, though, in practice, a threatening view to those people who, the bourgeoisie, the people who own businesses and have wealth and influence in the system as it exists, in the capitalist system. And so you have, growing up in communist Soviet Union, a system where there's a one-party state. The workers are now trying to resist, fight back, counter-revolution. They use the police very heavily in that, as a police state, where Stalin in particular uses them to, in his paranoia, to purge, to victimize loads of people in the 1930s. The economy is controlled by the state. On the upside, there are welfare benefits for the people, and in theory, people are equal and are treated equally. On the other hand, in the capitalist West, and particularly in America, who are the big players in the Cold War, we have a democracy where after the First World War, pretty much everyone gets a vote straight away. It's not based upon wealth anymore. Political freedom. The economy is led by the market, by the idea like how much you can sell, and the prices are set by the market as well, rather than being set by the government. Therefore, you are free in this situation to go and make money. You can set up your own business, and that will thrive or fail based upon the market rather than based upon the government or restrictions that the government puts on you. The other thing that comes about is individual freedom. So it's very much kind of an individual way of thinking. Now, that ideological, I mean, they just clash. They are literally, the communists are saying that system is wrong, we need to overthrow it. And because of that, of course, the capitalists feel threatened by and concerned about communism. So there's no doubt that these two ideologies do conflict. The question is whether before the Second World War, those were in a theoretical conflict, but not really affecting each other, or whether they were already jarring and sparking against each other in a Cold War. Now, the Cold War is, of course, a war of tension rather than a war of fighting. So are they already in a tense standoff, or are they just ignoring each other and then kind of not in the same room? Now, and there's a timeline on the PowerPoint, and what I'd like you to do, there's a worksheet attached to your Google Classroom as well. I'd like to go through the events before the Second War, just sketch out, just really briefly, get yourself a sense of what happens in these events. You can use the Williamson book, which is in the background reading bit on the internet. I'll try and attach that in the Google Classroom. And pages 6 to 11 take you through these events, or use the textbook or something else if you've got access to that. But I'd like to have a look at, does this show that there was tension in the air? There are two kind of phases. The first phase is around the Russian Revolution, 1917. The Bolsheviks, who become the Communist Party, they overthrow the government in Russia and set up a communist state. Almost immediately, they're thrown into the civil war. In that civil war, the Western powers help the resistance to the communist. And so right from the start, there's tension between capitalists and communists, and it's involved in fighting and direct opposition. Not much happens then through the rest of the 20s and 30s. The Soviet Union is quite isolated. Into the mid to late 30s, a bunch of events happen which are where the Soviet Union is trying to get back into kind of international relations and international society, I suppose, because of the growing threat of the Nazis. They're very concerned that the Nazis have said, or Hitler said in Mein Kampf, I'm looking east and I don't like the Slavs and communists. And so the Soviets are very worried about this. They join the League of Nations, they take the socialist side in the Spanish Civil War. They sign a treaty of mutual assistance with France and Czechoslovakia. And then in 1939, they try and get some sort of alliance, a bit like the First War alliance with Britain and France. But that fails, and of course, the Nazis eventually sign a pact with, or very quickly actually sign a pact with the Soviets in 1939, and that releases the Nazis to fight the first couple of years of the Second World War. The Munich Agreement is key here because the Munich Agreement is cooked up between France and Germany and Britain. It's about Czechoslovakia. The Italians help them out with that. Key to our discussion, the Soviets are not included at all in those discussions, not even invited to Munich, not even let in on the conversation. All of this seems to signal to Stalin that actually the Western powers don't like him very much. And there's a sense in which he already feels some sort of threat. My question to you is, how credible is that to say that actually the Cold War started in 1917, perhaps even in the 30s? Or would you characterize it as some tension, but not yet hostility, which is, of course, what a war is? So have a look at that, and we'll pick up on that in one of our Zoom sessions later on. Have fun. Take care. Bye-bye.